Hello, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Next Generation of EHR Medical Device Interoperability. Our webinar today is facilitated by the Texas Medical Device Alliance, and I would like to thank Elisa Maldonado-Holmertz of TMDA for her contribution and leadership. My name is Keith Drake. I'm the Vice President of Business Development for Galen Data. I will be your moderator for this presentation. Our topic today is timely and relevant. We're witnessing a rapid growth in the Internet of Medical Things, cloud-connected medical devices. This growth presents new challenges and opportunities for EHR vendors and medical device manufacturers to partner and develop interoperability strategies. Our goal today is to help you better understand the technical, business, and clinical considerations with integrating EHR systems and medical devices. You can submit your Q&A session questions at any time in the questions window. If we don't get to your question during the Q&A session, we'll follow up with you after the webinar. Handouts with an overview of our panelist companies and other partners is available at any time during the webinar. A recording of this webinar will be provided in a follow-up email. So now let's get to our discussion. Our panelists today include Neil Simon, the COO of eMDs, Sajol Ghoshal, the CEO of Cardi by Advanced Telesensors, Darrel Woelk, CTO of Green Room Technologies, and Chris DuPont, CEO of Galen Data. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
To kick things off, I'd like for each panelist to spend 1 to 2 minutes sharing about their company and giving a brief perspective on integrating medical devices and EHR systems. So Neil, we are going to kick things off with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting this seminar. I think it's a really timely and interesting subject. I'm Neil Simon. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at eMDs. eMDs have been around for over 23 years. We have various both medical record, practice management, and RCM services that we deploy to our customers. Our customer base tends to be from the smaller to mid-sized independent physician practices, although we do have larger practices in some hospitals that utilize our system. As a certified system, and with now the 21st Century Cures Act coming out, we have a lot of interest in this area because one of the things that everyone's pushing for is for EHRs to open up their data streams so that both data can be put into the systems by patients via different API methodologies, and data can be pulled out by patients. And so I think it's a very timely discussion. I've been in this industry myself personally for over 16 years and really have a lot of aspects on what's worked in the past in integrating devices and what the challenges are of integrating devices in the past.
Very good, thank you. Next, we'll move over to Sajol. Sajol, tell us about yourself and your exciting company.
Thanks, Keith. I'm Sajol Ghoshal, the CEO of Cardi. Cardi is a touchless heart rate monitoring device that we're going to target for elder care applications. The device uses radar technology, so it doesn't touch you. You don't have to wear a wearable, and we can read your heart rate and your respiration from a distance of up to 10 feet at this time. This is particularly very applicable today, of course, with COVID-19, and of course, everyone is, is moving to the contactless and touchless environment. Our device does offer the ability for which you can monitor a person remotely for multiple cardiac elements like heart rate and respiratory rate, and provide that information back. Our current target market is elder care in assisted living homes, where we see the device being extremely useful, especially with elders that are living alone. And most often are not attended extensively in the night from 7 in the night to 7 in the morning. We can provide rapid response because when we see an alert that occurs if a heart rate exceeds, for instance, 100 beats per minute, we can send out an alert on your smartphone and you can get an immediate response rather than the old approach, which is to walk around the rooms every 30 or 40 minutes and check on your residents. So we're very excited about the technology. We see it as a health tech device in the first part of the year. And then in 2021, we expect to migrate into an FDA compliant device.
So Joel, that's you're bringing Star Trek to life, it sounds like.
It does. It does. It is amazing technology. That's for sure.
That's very exciting. Next, we'll move to Darrel Woelk of Green Room Technologies. Darrel, welcome.
Thank you, Keith. So I'm Darrel Woelk, CTO of Green Rooms Technologies. We're a consulting company. We work with health technology startup companies that either have medical device products or healthcare software products. And we specialize in analyzing business, market, and interoperability readiness. So this is a good topic for us today. And we look at the client's product in the healthcare market, identify gaps in readiness, and then help clients close those gaps to ensure the viability of their business. For the last 6 years, I've been working with the HL7 Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources Standard, initials FHIR and pronounced FHIR. Recently, compliance with the FHIR standard is a key requirement for interoperability and data sharing in the recently announced ONC and CMS rulings. So these ONC and CMS rulings focus primarily on reading data from EHRs, but this also opens up some possible opportunities for connected medical device companies. We want to talk about that today. At HL7, we're now collaborating with a number of different standards organizations and consortia in trying to come up with a standard architecture for both point of care medical devices and personal health medical devices. So we're working with IEEE, IHE, Continue and Open Health Initiative. We'll look at both of those types of devices. At Green Room, then, we help our medical product clients understand where they can leverage interoperability, where they could have strategic partnerships to lower the risk and to focus the resources on the unique product features that they have.
Very good, very good. Thank you. And last but not least, Chris DuPont, Galen Data. Tell us about yourself and Galen.
Thank you, Keith, for that introduction. It's an honor and privilege to be here. Galen Data is a configurable, scalable software platform that makes it easy to connect medical devices to an FDA-compliant cloud. And we do it at a fraction of the cost and schedule, along with providing a host of other services. Now, when a medical device manufacturer decides to connect, they simply use the Galen platform to create a data model of their device and have connectivity in a matter of weeks. From a platform perspective, Galen takes care of all the FDA regulations, ISO standards, cybersecurity, and HIPAA. Galen is also certified to the Medical Device Quality Management Standard, ISO 13485. Thanks, Keith.
Well, thank you, Chris. Very exciting, and we've got a very experienced and talented panel, and I look forward to our discussion. Let's now take that deeper dive into the discussion of the technical, the business, and the clinical issues, and we'll start out with the technical considerations for EHR medical device interoperability. And Neil, I'm gonna kick things off with you in our discussion. Neil, can you define what interoperability means and why it is important for medical devices and EHR systems to connect seamlessly?
So thank you very much. So when I think most people think of interoperability, what do they mean? What they mean is if I have data that I have captured, whether it be on a smartphone, whether it be on some type of medical device like a blood pressure cuff or a monitor or a heart rate, that data can then get seamlessly transferred in some manner to their physician's electronic health record, so that physician can look at that data, process that data, analyze that data, and that's really the goal. And the other way too, that information from the EHRs can get downloaded or transferred to different devices, whether it be their patient's own personal health record or other devices that need that information can also come down from the medical record into that device. The challenge has been in the past, and even still today as we're working through it, is that there's thousands of devices out there and thousands of EHRs out there, and they all talk their own proprietary language and their own ways of communicating. And then in the past, it was even difficult. How do you get the data between those devices, right? How do you get the data from the device to the EHR and vice versa? Whether it was a USB stick or a smart card or using the internet. And so all those were challenges that we have in doing this thing. And as we mentioned earlier, one of the goals of the 21st Century Cures Act is to create a standard called Smart on Fire that will hopefully make that much less difficult and seamless. And it's not just the data that's important that you have to think about, but it's also authorization. How do you know that that person is that right person who's supposed to get that data, or the right person who's supposed to upload that data? That's important as well. And again, some of those things have been challenges in the past that we're hoping with a lot more technology now that's been standardized to overcome those challenges and make it much more plug and play.
Very good characterization. So Joel, I'm going to shift the conversation to you. What we're talking about today really starts with the patient and the device that they're wearing, or in your case, the device they're being monitored by remotely. What are you doing within your company to enable your medical device to interoperate with EHRs?
That's a really good question, Pete. I think interoperability is the key to almost any medical device, entering a high volume type of environment. And that's the target for a lot of medical devices. There has been history of how interoperability has worked. If you go back to the early 90s, networking was in a similar state that we have, the medical devices today on. A lot of ad hoc networks and the inability to connect across or have custom connections that were required to make that work. The market exploded because we standardized on Ethernet, we standardized on IEEE standards, and we standardized on interfaces that any device can connect to the network. And I see that as a very successful model that we should be able to take towards the medical devices. So today, what we have is, we are building a device that can connect across to the cloud. We can connect to different cloud things, whether it's AWS or Azure or any of the other ones that are going to be available. The question is, how do we interconnect all these devices so that someone else at a different portal can get a holistic, broad view of all the players that are involved for that particular patient? And that's why I think we really think Galen data with the standard cloud structure will be really key to connecting our system. So we're trying to connect into Galen data that would then be the host for everyone else to connect to, because our ability to connect to every thousands or millions of medical devices will be very, very limited.
Very good. That's a good perspective. Darrel, over to you. Let's broaden the perspective a little bit. How does this challenge, I'll say, of interoperability vary from EHR system to EHR system?
So HL7 has been working on healthcare data exchange standards since 1987. And in fact, one of the standards that's still in use today, HL7 V2, was first designed in 1987, became popular in the mid-90s. So the problem's been around for a long time. What's unique about FHIR is this latest generation where we've taken a lot of the tools and environments in other industries and applied that in healthcare. So we have a REST API, we have JSON and XML representations. The other thing that's happened is that the industry has really gotten on board with FHIR. So the Argonaut project has been going on now for 5 or 6 years, and this is the industry EHR vendors have gathered together and collaborated to decide finally which parts of the standard they're all going to implement to test their implementations with each other. So there's a strong effort from the industry to make this happen. Neil mentioned Smart on Fire a while ago. It's not enough just to have access to the data. What we'd like to have is a way of having an EHR launch a third-party application so that you not only get the data, but you can also get the application. And that's Smart on Fire. There's also something called CDS Hooks, which is similar to Smart on Fire, but you register a clinical decision support app to execute at some point in the clinical workflow. So this is a way of adding innovation around the data. But the ONC and CMS rules are really only focused on reading healthcare data, not on writing. So as medical device companies, we're still using HL7 V2 and other less efficient ways of doing things. At Green Room Technology, we partner with companies like Redox and others who have made a business out of having integration engines that kind of work around the differences and take care of some of the eccentricities of the HL7 V2. These enterprise integration engines now are beginning to provide a Fire API so they can take Fire resources in and convert those to HL7v2. So we're kind of in a area now of transition. The Fire standard itself is more than just a data exchange standard. It's actually a data model, a API, and a set of query language. So you can actually think in terms of a Fire server, which is holding Fire data. EHR companies then convert their data they have, internal formats, into Fire. So what's happened because of that, we now have about 15 different publicly available Fire servers as reference servers, but also Google, Microsoft, and IBM are now productizing, commercializing Fire servers. So we're seeing a transition kind of in that market. Specifically for medical devices, in HL7, we have a working group for medical devices working group. And there we've defined a Fire resource, a couple of Fire resources that are equivalent to the IEEE 11073 standard for status and location of resources. And so what we believe this will do is allow us to have in Fire and accessible through Smart on Fire and CDS hooks, data about the device along with data of the observations and procedures that reference that specific device. And we see this a way of bringing together all of that data so we can do things like predictive analytics and AI.
So it's definitely not plug and play, but a lot better than it used to be, and heading in the right direction. Chris, I'm gonna shift things over to you now for our last couple minutes in this technical segment. And you've talked over the years, and especially at Galen Data, you've spoken with medical device companies. In speaking with them, where do they need to focus when it comes to working with and designing for interoperability with EHR systems?
I think that's a great question. I think that the very first step is, and let me even back up one step, is in today's world, most medical devices are not connected. They're standalone devices. They have to go in and get interrogated by their physician or their clinical specialist to get information. I used to have to support class 3 medical devices where we'd have failures in the field. So I think the very first answer to your question is medical devices today need to be connected. And that's step one. You know, there is no equivalent of a check engine light in today's medical device. So step two is then be able to transmit that information directly into an EHR system. That capability doesn't exist today. There might be some one-off solutions, but as you can see with the virus today and the fact that we're all working from home, it's kind of crazy in a connected world that we live in that patients, fathers, mothers, caregivers don't have immediate access to healthcare information. So I think first, you have to get connected and then get integrated into an EHR system.
Very good, very good. Well, you know, the technology is the fun part, but the business is what pays the bills. So let's shift our conversation to the business aspects of medical device and EHR integration. Neil, I'm gonna kick this off with you again. I know in talking with you over the past few weeks, you've got a lot of experience here. Can you tell us specifically your current efforts integrating medical devices into your EHR system at eMDs, and specifically, how has that number of medical devices grown? What kinds of devices are you integrating? And what is your strategy for evaluating device makers in the first place to consider integrating them? What are the things you look at there?
Yeah, there was a lot of questions there in one. So, you know, right now mainly our device integrations have really been not so much on the patient side, but at the physician office side. So really focused on, stuff, for example, like, vital machines, heart rate, pulsometric, I can't say that word, pulsometric machines, those types of devices that a physician uses in their office. And generally, we've partnered with certain vendors that have good market share, that have the big market shares in those spaces, and partnered with those specific devices. The challenge has been with those devices, of course, is each one of those partnerships is one-off. So the way we work with one vitals machine is very different than the way we work with another vitals machine. And we've tried to integrate them to be as, efficient as possible for the nurses or the physicians that are using them. So that's kind of how we've done it today. I think in the future, though, we're trying to get much more to a plug-and-play environment because, again, that's not a scalable solution that we've come up with. And of course, as we mentioned before, a lot more now of patient-entered data. But one of the challenges from an EHR perspective too, we get patient-entered data, right? If you just take blood pressure, for example, and you take a typical patient, maybe they see a physician twice a year, 3 times a year, 4 times a year, you got 3, 4 blood pressures, and that's all the physician gets to see. If all of a sudden you're uploading all the blood pressures from home and the patient's taking it twice a day, now all of a sudden you have a lot more data that physician needs to weed through, and therefore the systems have to be built in an efficient way that they can analyze that data without having to go through, 200 or 300 data points.
Very good, very good. That's interesting. That's a good perspective. So Joel, over to you. What business opportunities, let's project forward 6 to 12 months. You're sending your data, hopefully, to the Galen cloud. You're integrating through the evolving FHIR standard so that interoperability with EHR systems is becoming more facilitating. What business opportunities does that present for you and your device and your company?
That's an excellent question. Once you can project the connectivity into that particular sphere, there is a huge opportunity. For us, for instance, in just elder care, there are 50 million seniors over the age of 65 in the US alone. And that number will go to 60 million by 2030. So that's a tremendous number of people. The second piece, as Neil had pointed out, is we are actually doing continuous 24/7 tracking. So you don't get this, I'll take your heart rate, once every 3 months or a couple of years, when you go to the doctor's office. We're tracking it continuously 24/7. You can change the sampling point to anything you need, but you generally get data every couple of seconds or every couple of minutes. That's a tremendous amount of data that's starting to stream out, but there's also a huge amount of information trying to show up. So we see the opportunities in the future is once you can get this integrated multi medical device connectivity in place that you can start to analyze, the amount of AI machines that you can bring to bear that can start to do predictive analysis would be really a key element. Cardio will produce a device that will probably give you 3 or 4 different sensory points around the cardio area. However, that we don't provide all the other, medical information that can be provided by other devices. When you fusion that information together and you start to see patterns, that's really where you see the big breakthroughs and the big changes.
Very good, thank you. Chris, again, with all the medical device companies you speak to, what are some common questions they have when it comes to integrating their devices with EHRs?
So half our customers or more have already requested deep integration with EHRs. To be competitive in today's market, they see that they must have connectivity. And they ask, with all the different medical device or EHR systems out there, how hard is it to connect? Galen is architected, and Darrel mentioned this several times, that Galen is architected to a standard called FHIR. So the whole principle is that FHIR makes it convenient. It's never easy, right? But it does make it convenient, and there is a standard that allows all these different medical devices to connect to different EHRs. And so whatever flavor of EHR is in whatever hospital, Galen will help facilitate that change. Now, we don't have that capability today, but we are architected to it, and we'll have it rolled out in about 4 months.
Good news, exciting news. And Darrel, finally, again, projecting forward the integration of the interoperability between medical devices and EHRs is much more facilitated. What impact will that have on reimbursement?
Yeah, I think that ultimately that's the question. The answer to that question really determines the viability of a business. So when we talk to a startup company about their technology, we also talk to them about their business, what's their value proposition. And we talk about that value proposition very early stages when we're helping them find investors. And it's important for a medical device company to work, especially with a point of care device, to work very early in integrating that with the established care pathways. And with collaboration with healthcare providers gives you a way of gaining the trust of physicians who ultimately will have an input into the decision. But we really see that there are 3 different value propositions for a company. One is with the buyer, and in the case of a point of care device, that would be probably the healthcare organization. That's the buyer. The user in this case would be a physician, and then the end beneficiary is a patient. So each of these potential user or potential people has a different value proposition that they're interested in, and it's important to sort of weigh who is the decision maker. The buyer normally wants to enhance patient care and provider satisfaction, but they're also looking at the bottom line. And the bottom line varies with the business model. And as you're probably aware, we're moving in healthcare from a fee-for-service to a value-based care model. So in a fee-for-service model, using my device might allow you to bring in more revenue with more services, whereas in a value-based care, I'm focused on how do I more efficiently get good patient outcomes. So the value proposition is different in each of those. The other thing we're beginning to see is that the pricing and business model innovation is also important as you're trying to market a device where the device manufacturer may take on some risk in value-based care in exchange for sort of take their risk in making better outcomes. So we're seeing a lot of changes going on, both on the business side and the technology side.
Very good. That's insightful. I appreciate that. We'll move to the last of the three main topics, and that is the clinical aspects. And Darrel, I'm going to continue with you. Can you comment on the FDA, the HIPAA compliance requirements that medical device makers and EHR vendors need to consider?
Yeah, so as we said a couple of times, the traditional role of medical devices in the healthcare ecosystem is changing as medical devices get connected to the cloud, as they become edge computers in the Internet of Medical Things, and become more than just passive sensors. So the HIPAA and FDA regulators, I think, are kind of struggling to both ensure patient safety and patient privacy without preventing those innovations that we've talked about that drive efficiencies in other industries. So we've seen examples in the area of HIPAA where some vendors have used HIPAA privacy regulations to justify information blocking. So as long as you're not allowing anyone to see the data, it doesn't go outside of your control, you have control of the data, you're not going to be breaking the HIPAA rules. Some other examples with Smart on Fire, the Smart on Fire framework uses the industry standard OAuth 2 and OpenID authorization and authentication. This was controversial at one time, that it's not the way we've done it in healthcare in the past. It's the way we do it in other industries. So in the world of HIPAA, also connected medical device manufacturers need to pay attention to HIPAA rules concerning covered entities and business associates of covered entities. So I'd be interested from Sajol and maybe Neil sort of understanding better, how you deal with those kind of things, the answer of whether you're a covered entity when you have possession of the HIPAA data. We're seeing interesting things happen with the wearable devices like Fitbit, where is my understanding if you're collecting patient data and not sharing it with a covered entity, then it's not covered by HIPAA. And there's some gray areas to me where with Fitbit, maybe you're gathering information about the device itself, whether that's considered HIPAA violation or not. With FDA, there's a lot of interesting things happen with AI-based software as a medical device. As we put more and more decision-making power into the software, there's some issues with FDA concerning how do you test such a device. And so the FDA has recently put out a discussion document about how do we look at medical devices that are learning. So you can't test it as it goes out into the field. It's learning and changing the software. So those are a few things that are changing in that world.
Again, brave new world and an exciting frontier. So Sajol, over to you. How will EHR integration impact the workflow for your specific device? Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, I think, Darrel brought up some good questions on how that affects the workflow and how the whole system would work. Currently we have information that we are sending in through the cloud, and our authentication process is partly what's on the cloud in terms of access, which is protected by HIPAA. But in addition, we have access login that is defined by any of the users that are authorized to be able to access the data. As we had said, we've got over 50 million people that are in this particular market space. That's a huge number of people. What we also need to be aware of from a clinical standpoint is 75% of them have cardiovascular disease. And so this device is going to become very, very important. There are variables that some of them use, but variable penetration in the elder care is very, very poor, 25%. So a lot of this data, as it starts to come through, becomes available to other aspects of information. So, for instance, there is going to be a time when we have a lot of this data, and you may remove the names and make it anonymous, but you'll have information across millions of people with various cardiovascular diseases, for instance, diabetes, heart failure or valve issues, and a whole slew of other devices. The question will become, with the data that we're gathering and with the knowledge that these particular diseases do exist, can you come up with either a preventive mechanism or a predictive mechanism for a particular disease, or the time when that disease actually enters a degradation phase that is much more rapid? So we see the workflow shifting to the other side of the cloud, as the devices start to pour data in, and you have a fair amount of a historical database where the workflow shifts over to the AI side. And as Darrel pointed out, it is going to be pretty consequential when an AI says that you have a particular sequence of events that could follow up based on the historical data of other millions of people in that same database.
Very good. Interesting. Neil, it occurs to me that everything we've talked about on this panel discussion so far has focused on data, different ways to look at data, the flow of data, the consideration of data. So a question for you in your EHR system, what about the influx of medical device data? Might that overwhelm the data management system? What are you guys planning to address that issue?
Yeah, I think we're definitely concerned about that. And there's another aspect I think is always important when you ever deal with healthcare, and that's liability, right? You talk to any physicians, what's their biggest fear, right? Is getting sued for malpractice and liability. And what happens if, all of a sudden I got this stream of data of 1,000 different pieces, and only one piece of that was a highlight of a serious condition, and of course the doctor didn't see that or didn't get highlighted to that piece of information. Now all of a sudden that patient gets sick, dies, and now there's a lawsuit. So there's a lot of concern there, things that you just don't think about in other spaces that's very cognizant on physicians' minds. And so as an EHR vendor, what we need to do is find ways to make sure that we understand the data and summarize in a fashion that we can highlight maybe that one or two outlier points that's there that physician really needs to pay attention to, and then not get that physician drowned or lost in just a myriad of data that most of it is, not meaningless, but not as useful or as important. And so that's definitely one of the fears that we have. And as we look at how we're going to integrate all these data points into our system, that's one. The second one is, there's all this various specific types of data. There's data that's, really known, like blood pressures and heart rates and stuff like that. But there's a lot of other data that's very device specific that you have to have a lot of domain knowledge. And so then as an EHR, how do we store that data? How do we analyze that data? How do we even display that data? Take an EKG waveform, right? There's definitely machines that know how to display all that and store all that data. But as a general EHR, we don't understand or analyze those forms, and each machine stores it differently too. So those become some of the challenges that we face as the EHR that we have to do it. And so those are barriers. I don't think they're insurmountable. I think they are definitely one of the things that we've talked a little bit about today, the idea of allowing the EHR as the portal to the data, but then the individual source of that data allows it to be analyzed and displayed and highlights to the physician what's important, because those device manufacturers know much more specifically about that data than we do on a general sense. And so those are some of the things I think that we'll see happening. The other thing we talked a little bit earlier is, HIPAA being an excuse to data blocking. Clearly, the government now with 21st Century Cures Act has said, no, that's not going to be an excuse anymore, and you can't use HIPAA as a reason to data block. And that they've defined the ownership of the data now to be the patient, and they've really defined that, where before it was very nebulous on who owned that data and who was responsible for it, and now they've really said it is the patient.
Those are some very interesting challenges, and it sounds like you and eMDs are at the forefront of addressing those. You identified them and you're tackling them. That's encouraging. Chris, for our last question in our clinical segment, and just briefly, can you share with us how you think EHR medical device interoperability will improve patient outcomes?
Absolutely. And in the theme of clinical, imagine let's start with a use case, and you're in a clinical trial for a new heart pump, an LVAD. Today, LVADs, most heart pumps, most medical devices aren't connected, but you've now made a decision to connect this LVAD, this heart pump, to a data source, to the Galen platform. You have a vibration sensor or an RPM sensor. And it just as Darrel, Sajol, and Neil said, is that you first have to get access to the data. Imagine now that heart pump, if it fails, that patient will die within a matter of minutes. But because you now have either an RPM sensor or a vibration sensor that can start to sense very small changes in vibration, such as the bearing in that heart pump is starting to fail. Through data analytics, predictive analytics, artificial intelligence, you can predict that bearing is going to fail 3 months into the future. You've now proactively taken action and you've saved that patient's life. And you can extend that into all different types of use cases. I think the real power is being able to do deep analysis, not just on one device, on a population of all different types of devices. Then you can start making correlations between these data elements and predict all kinds of very helpful health outcomes. And then you can obviously integrate that into the EHR systems too.
Wonderful. Wow. Exciting. It's a good industry to be in, isn't it, gentlemen? Especially now, and just getting more exciting. So let's wrap up our discussion before we move to the questions from the audience. So with some final thoughts. Neil, I'll start off with you again. What advice would you give to device makers who want to connect to your EHR system?
I mean, my biggest advice is really try to use industry standards. The more you can really do stuff like based on FHIR, based on HL7, the easier it's going to be to integrate that data into our systems. Because again, if we have to do custom integrations for every device, that's all we would ever do. And of course, we have a lot more things to do than just that with all the other government regulations. So really try to rely on industry standards, try to come up with a way to make that data model understandable by devices, and even make a way for us to use your tool as a way to analyze and display your own data, so the EHR is not having to do all the work. And the more we can leverage what you've already provided us using industry standards, I think the more EHRs you'll be able to integrate with, and the faster you'll be able to see the benefit of that in your device and be able to market it out to either patients or physicians.
Good advice, good advice. And I'm going to ask the same question, but flip it around to you, Sajol. What advice would you give EHR vendors wanting to work with medical device manufacturers like yourself?
Good question. I think Chris had already talked a little bit about some of the information that some of the devices would provide, and I think what medical records would have to really start to do is categorize the information. We're going to have so much information coming through that the question will become, what is critical and what is time critical? And that separation will be really unique, because there'll be some pieces of data that need immediate response because it becomes a mission critical or life threatening event, versus a device that's continuously giving information and it can be analyzed at a future date or through an AI engine, but it's not critical. So that's really what I think is going to be very important, is that we have to be able to separate and provide a really good response time for critical events or critical data that comes in the case when a person's having a cardiac event, or we've detected a situation which was seen in one of our Alzheimer deployments, where the heart rate suddenly goes up to 105 and stays there for 3 hours. That's a pretty significant change that needs to be sent out relatively quickly.
Interesting, very good. Chris, in your crystal ball, where is medical device connectivity heading, and how will it shape the way that medical device makers and EHRs work together?
Yeah, I go back to my opening statement, is that most medical devices today are not connected. We all watch a lot of news. We're living in this current COVID crisis. It's crazy that you have to spend 3, 4, 7 hours in a line to drive under a white tent and get your nose swabbed, and then wait 2 or 3 weeks to get the results. That's simply unacceptable in today's world. I think as we emerge from this crisis, medical devices, medical technology won't just want, they will demand the capability to have connection, get that information, analyze that information, and get that information directly into the EHR system where the caring physician from an at-home test can give you a result within a day. I think that's clearly where the industry is going, and everybody on this panel sees that, and we hope to be part of that solution, help facilitate that change.
And Darrel, I'll ask you a similar question. You've got a very broad perspective on all components of our topic today. So where do you envision interoperability? What do you envision it looking like in the next few years?
Yeah, I see a couple of things happening. One is that, we've focused in fire in the last 6 years, focused on EHRs and that sort of portion of the healthcare industry. The Argonaut project brought the EHR vendors together. The Da Vinci project is now a project with the insurance company and healthcare providers to exchange data between insurance companies and healthcare providers, both patient data and payer data. So the industry is just waiting for some kind of a standard. So the FHIR model is flexible enough. The APIs are the latest advanced types of things that we'll see. Now HL7 is using Da Vinci and Argonaut as a model for what we call accelerator projects. So we're now seeing accelerator projects start up in the area of clinical research, consumer-directed patient data access, cancer care, and social determinants of health, where different parts of the healthcare industry are closing in using FHIR because of the way it's been designed. The other interesting thing that's happening is because of this, that we leverage software tools and development environments that are familiar to a lot of developers. This shortens the learning curve for developers and allows more companies to get involved doing innovative ideas and solutions. The interest from application developers and university researchers is increasing because of this. So I'm actually teaching a series of tutorials at the University of Texas in the School of Information and the Business School. And the tutorials cover the FHIR model, how you write applications based on FHIR, kind of those kind of technical topics, but they also touch on 3 other areas that I think are important. One is the business aspect of FHIR. What's going to be the impact of FHIR on the insurance industry, on the clinical research industry? The second one is, now that we have this common data model, we can build on top of that higher level languages that leverage FHIR data model, but focus more on the semantics of healthcare. So one example is the clinical quality language, which has been developed over the last 4 years, which is an executable way of creating executable quality measures. So this allows subject matter experts to design quality measures that then execute automatically in an EHR through an interpreter, as opposed to putting together a PDF file that describes what should be done and then having that converted into code. And the last thing that's exciting to me is that we're working on the integration of FHIR data with the semantic web and the linked open data world. So FHIR has an RDF format. RDF is the format that's used for the semantic web Sparkle queries for OWL reasoning tools. So I've got students at the University of Texas working on projects using the RDF representation of FHIR, using Smart on FHIR to write applications. So I think these are all ways that the traditional healthcare providers, insurance companies, and university researchers and application developers can all work together to collaborate on these new things, really driving away, going beyond data interoperability to knowledge interoperability, which is really what we're talking about when we talk about AI, we talk about the real goal of better patient outcomes. And I think medical devices are part of this big picture. So once we have medical devices connected to the cloud, once we have them acting as edge computers in an internet of medical things, they have a critical role in generating real-time data and knowledge about the status of patients. I think that's going to be the future.
Well, and thank you for those comments, Darrel. I think you've summarized my main takeaway from this discussion, in that it takes an advanced and reliable medical device like yours, Sajol, it requires a industry-leading EHR, Neil, like your eMDs system. It takes that cloud connectivity and platform like Galen Data provides, and it requires, Darrel, your expertise, that overall perspective on each of those elements, and in a word, collaboration. We can design the standards, we can do our own job in our silos, but it takes that collaboration across the broad range of everything we've talked about in order to succeed. Before we get to our questions, I'd like to make a couple announcements. The first is a very exciting virtual summit sponsored by Greenlight Guru, an industry-leading QMS system. It'll occur June 2nd through 4th. There are 3 tracks, their Go track, their Grow track, and their COVID-19 track. Galen Data will be presenting a track entitled Design Considerations to Maximize Medical Device Cloud Connectivity on June 2nd. Keep an eye out for that. Contact us for the registration link. I'm also excited to announce Galen Data's Medical Device Connectivity Innovation Webinar Series. We've had a discussion here internally. We have a lot of fun putting these webinars together, and we've committed to a monthly webinar from a compliant cloud connectivity perspective, presenting information on topics like an outlook for 2020, AI and data analytics that we've touched on today, the impact of 5G technology and what that has on the medical device and health IT industry, privacy and security, and then of course, COVID-19 use cases that we are seeing and experiencing ourselves. So, to our questions. You can submit your questions in the question window in the GoToWebinar console. If we have a lot of questions, we can go past an hour. And I'll remind everybody that a recording of this webinar will be provided via email. So I already see a lot of questions coming in. Chris, I'll toss this first one to you. It's a good question. Talking about the data, who maintains ownership and control of the data that devices generate that are transmitted through a cloud platform such as the Galen Cloud to the EHR?
The original equipment manufacturer, the company that manufactures the device, they control the data. They have absolute ownership of the data. Galen has no rights to their data.
Very good, very good. So Joel, the next question I think is for you. Does having cloud connectivity make your sales pitch easier to EHRs?
Yes, I mean, actually, that is a big seller, because mentally everyone's moving, as Chris had mentioned, to unconnected medical devices, and to get that speed of scalability. The key has to be scalability of these devices into this ecosystem. And having a cloud connected system where it just seamlessly connects into the EMR system would be really key. And that really helps our selling.
Very good. Let me see. Let me read this next one. Neil, I think this is probably a good question for you. Do medical device companies that have an ability to integrate to your EHR have an advantage?
Yeah, I definitely think they do, because when it comes to physicians purchasing those devices, they look to the EHRs and say, hey, I want to purchase a device that's going to integrate with your EHR. So I'm not having to double enter the data. I want to save time. So it's definitely, I know both from if they own currently one of our EHRs and they want to buy a certain type of machine, they're going to ask us, who do you integrate with? And that gives those vendors a leg up on selling that product. It works the other way too. If they have those products, then they'll come to us and say, hey, what EHRs work with these products? And if we're able to say yes, that gives us an advantage. So I think it works both ways in that side. And so it's definitely something I think really makes a difference when physicians look to what devices they're going to use in their office setting.
Yeah, that is, I'll make a comment. That is encouraging for me to hear that clinicians are not just looking at the efficacy of the device, the value that the EHR provides, but the interoperability, that is part of their focus. That's very encouraging. Let's see, okay, this is obviously a good question for you, Darrel, and it springboards off of a lot of your comments this afternoon. what should companies, medical device companies, I assume, do to get a better handle on fire, on the fire standard?
Yeah, so the fire specification is open. It's an open standard, there's no fees associated with it. The specification is online on the web. It's well organized, it's detailed. A lot of work has gone into it. So there's a lot of good documentation. Green Room Technologies, we offer a variety of different types of workshops specifically for developers, the kind of things that I was teaching University of Texas, or specifically for product management type people who are looking at fire in the bigger picture of how that all fits together. So we do those kind of workshops. The best ones are the ones where we sit down and really go into the strategy behind the product, touching on a lot of the things that the four of us have talked about today. We also do a business viability assessment that we offer as a service, and that goes into both market readiness and technical readiness. And a big part of that technical readiness is helping a company understand where the standards are today, where they're going, and how they can leverage fire or leverage some of the older HL7 standards like HL7 V2.
Very good. I really like this next question. We're going to change our format a little bit and do a rapid fire. So I'm going to pose the question to all four of you. I'll call on you individually. Just, your quick hit, 20 to 30 second answer for each. And Chris, I'll start with you. The question is, do you think that large established medical device companies who have traditionally been reluctant to share data with each other will truly embrace interoperability even if standards are agreed upon?
I think they have to. There's no choice. To be competitive in this new connected world, you're going to have connectivity and interoperability with the EHR systems. Absolutely, yes.
Neil, what do you think about that?
Oh, definitely. I think that, with all the emphasis on not allowing data blocking and sharing of information, that's definitely something that's going to change rapidly as the data becomes, protected and concerned about patient information, but more available to everybody else.
So Joel.
I think the business is going to drive a lot of that. The ability to share data must provide a lot more business for those large medical devices companies. So I think we can see that the scalability of the system will drive it to the point where their business actually shrinks if they stay in this isolated, silo versus working across everyone else.
Darrel.
Yeah, I think they will, and I think that it may be similar to what we've seen with EHR vendors and insurance companies. That there's a market, kind of a market that grows, and at some point you have to partake in that. You have to be part of that standards world in order to stay in the market.
So it's not just do they want to, but yes.
Yeah.
This next question, and I'll, just so we don't talk over each other, raise your hand if you want to take it, and then I'll call on you. It's another really good question from our audience today. What do you believe is the next step for patients truly owning and having access to all their medical data? And as a follow-up, do you think blockchain is part of that future solution? Who wants to take that? Darrel.
Once again, I see fire as a solution. What's happening with I talked about fire servers. I can actually put together an open source fire server for my patient data, for my own data, and I can gather my data from the various EHR vendors and control that data myself. So there are technical solutions that are there today. What's missing in all of this, I think, is consent management. So that in the past, the way we've done consent management is we wrap our arms around the data, and on paper we keep track of who can see it. I think once we really have the patient in control of their own data and have the ability to consent, essentially to make the data available in exchange for something, I think we'll begin to see that ownership, patient ownership of their own data begin to make sense in a commercial sense, I think.
Does anybody else want to address patient ownership? Yes, Sajol.
Well, one of the things I've noticed is that, as you get older or even at some middle age kind of thing, you are using a lot of pharmaceutical drugs, right? And that whole complexity of that is handled by different specialities. One of the things that patient data, that when a patient gets access to it, they can see it in a holistic view. And if you had an AI engine behind that, you could start to tie certain symptoms to the kind of drugs that you're being used. So for instance, there are over 30 blood pressure medications. I know that because of my mother. Certain things happen, then they change the blood pressure medication based on the symptomatic response. And that still takes a huge loop of a doctor being in the game. I think when you have a patient record that you can look at it and you have an AI engine on top that can provide you the information saying a percentage of these patients will have this problem with this drug and you may want to try something else, it changes the scope, but it has to come through the patient.
Very good. Anybody else want to pile onto that one? Let me move on then. Chris, a good question for you in Galen data. Question reads, and I think we as a technological society, we are enabling capture of a massive amount of data to manage. What changes are needed to the infrastructure, if any, to scale for data transmission, storage, and access in order to access and utilize that information intelligently?
I'll even back up. To do any analysis of the data, you first must have access to the data. And so, again, I go back to my original statement. Most medical devices are not connected. That's step one. You have to get those medical devices connected. You have to make it easy. You have to comply with all these different regulations, and you have to make it affordable. I was in the business of building these systems, $500,000 to $1 million a pop, custom, and then we'd have to start over. If we can remove those barriers, make it easy, affordable, along with complying with all these different regulations, that's the baby step. Then everything else will come after that. But you have to take that first step of connectivity.
Very good. Very good. Good. Very insightful. Let me see. Another question that came in, and I'll ask for a show of hands to see who wants to address it. As we see some consolidation of traditionally standalone medical practices, I'm interested in multi-office coordination through cloud-based software to see a patient anywhere, including online. Any process hurdles to overcome in that goal? Neil.
Well, I mean, I think we've definitely been seeing that happen over time as practices get larger and they run as a larger practice. I think we're seeing a lot of information now where the systems like ourselves, our EHR, are built for that kind of model. So, and with the internet around and better connectivity between offices, it really works well. Probably the challenge, so that part I think is really being solved, and systems have solved that, and we'll continue to see that trend for larger groups. But, we've also seen the other side. We've seen hospitals buy a lot of practices, and then the physicians come back out of the hospitals because hospitals have not been historically or today good stewards of ambulatory practices and running them in an effective fashion. So I think we'll see that, but I think the software and the tools are there today that really help allow those practices to run pretty well.
Very good. We've got about a minute to go, so I am going to put a wrap on this in the interest of our attendees' time, but we do have a few more questions we haven't gotten to. So after I close things out here, if you gentlemen can stay on for another 5 minutes or so, we'll continue with our questions. But I would like to thank all of our panelists for their participation today. My personal thanks to you, Neil, Sajol, Darrel, and Chris for your insight, for your guidance, and thanks to our audience as well for attending our webinar and for your great questions. When we end the webinar here in a couple minutes, you'll be presented with a short optional survey. We'd appreciate you filling that out to let us know how we did. We look forward to seeing you at a future Galen Data webinar. Please let us know, any of our panelists, let us know if there's anything we can do to help you before then. So with that, if you need to go, that's great. But if not, we've got just a couple more questions that I'd like to ask. Sajol, for you, what needs to be done at the front end of medical device design to ensure interoperability and compatibility with cloud and EHR technology?
I think one of the things that, for a device, a medical device manufacturer, would be a common API that we can connect into, where we are not dependent on the type of cloud we use, whether it's AWS or Azure or any of the other multitude cloud structures that will come up. Because we're sort of not going to be worried much about what cloud system we work into. We'd like to be able to connect with a standard API. That allows other device manufacturers to come into the same sort of connectivity zone. And once the data management information has been standardized, you can then start to use that quite easily across the other boundaries. For instance, we at this point can do cardiac measurements of heart rate and respiratory rate. We do not have blood pressure right now. And blood pressure is an important cardiac characteristic that would be useful. So having that instrument that would work and come up seamlessly on our portal, in addition to our device, would be very crucial to get a broader picture of what's happening with the particular user.
Very good. Our last question, and I'll ask for a show of hands, see who wants to take it. It's a little long, there's a lot of preface. It seems to me that technology companies have a head start on the cloud/data infrastructure that will be required for this knowledge interoperability where medical devices are part of the mix. I see a possibility where software companies buy out medical technology companies or take control of the platform. How do you see this possibly playing out and these two different worlds colliding? Who wants that? Darrel.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand the question. And I think that those technology companies underestimate the healthcare industry. So I think there's the technology, and then there's the hundreds of years of medical knowledge. And until we get to the pure AI kind of thing where we can come close to replacing physicians and replacing people like our panelists here who have been in the medical industry for 20 or 30 years, I think those big technology companies, Apple, Google, Microsoft, they may acquire some companies, but I think there's a sort of enough to go around for all of us.
And that is a great point to end our webinar today. Gentlemen, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your insight. This has been a great discussion. Thank you to our audience for your attention. Again, if there's anything that we can do to help you in the future, any of our panelists, please let us know. Thanks again, and goodbye.